Dawn light filtered through Ravenscroft's library windows, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. Clara and Sebastian stood on opposite sides of his desk, the king's invitation lying between them like a bridge or a chasm. She couldn't tell which yet. He defied a lord for her, defied the crown for her, gave up everything for her. Now, for the first time since the snow, the choice was hers. Sebastian's face held an expression she'd never seen before. Not the stoic duke who'd found her dying, not the calculating strategist who'd outmaneuvered Blackwood, not even the exhausted man who'd survived the king's games. This was something rawer, vulnerable, waiting, not demanding, not claiming, just hoping. Clara's hand lifted slowly, trembling as it moved toward his across the polished mahogany. Her fingers hovered in the space between them, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. But she hesitated, suspended in that terrible, beautiful moment where everything hung in balance. Because this time, no one was forcing her hand. No warrant, no poison, no threat, just choice, pure, terrifying, liberating choice. Her voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. What am I allowed to take from a man who's already given me everything? If you skip now, you'll never know what she chooses, and after everything they survived together, you owe it to them to see how their story ends. Don't be the person who watched parts 1 and 2 but missed the moment that made it all worth it. Clara woke alone in her room, morning light streaming through curtains she didn't remember closing. The memory of last night's kiss lingered on her lips, desperate and certain and terrifyingly real. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, half expecting to find evidence that it had actually happened, that she hadn't dreamed the way Sebastian had looked at her when she'd said "I'm staying." She dressed slowly, uncertain. What came next? What was she supposed to do the morning after choosing someone not out of fear or gratitude, but because she wanted to? The breakfast room felt impossibly formal when she entered. Sebastian stood by the window reading correspondence, already dressed for the day. He looked up when she arrived, and for a fraction of a second, she saw relief flash across his face before it settled into something carefully neutral. "Good morning." His voice was polite, respectful, the same tone he'd used when she was recovering from poison, when every word had been measured to give her space. "Good morning." Clara took her seat, and Sebastian returned to the window, maintaining a distance that felt both considerate and unbearable. They ate in silence punctuated only by the clink of silverware against china. Sebastian asked about her plans for the day, her foundation work, correspondence she needed to handle. She answered. He listened. They were painfully, professionally courteous, and Clara wanted to scream. This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd chosen him, kissed him, declared her intention to stay. And now he was treating her like a house guest he was determined not to offend. "Sebastian." She set down her teacup with more force than intended. "What are we doing?" He looked up from the letter he'd been pretending to read. "I'm sorry. This." She gestured between them. "Yesterday we kissed. Last night I told you I was choosing you. And this morning you're standing as far away from me as this room allows and discussing the weather. I'm giving you space." "I don't want space. I want." She stopped, frustrated because she didn't actually know how to finish that sentence. What did she want? Sebastian set down his letter and crossed to the table, but he didn't sit. He stood close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and in them she saw the same uncertainty she felt. "What do you want from me, Sebastian?" The question came out rawer than intended. "After everything, after all of this, what do you actually want?" His answer came without hesitation, but his voice was gentle. "Whatever you're willing to give. Nothing more." Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Every other man in her life had taken. Her father trading her in marriage, Blackwood taking her body and nearly her life. Even society taking her dignity in that courtroom. They'd all claimed pieces of her without asking, without waiting, without caring if she wanted to give them. But Sebastian stood before her offering her complete control. Not because he didn't want her. She could see the want in the tension of his shoulders, the careful way he kept his hands at his sides. But because he was waiting for her permission. Her choice. Her terms. "I don't know what I'm willing to give yet," Clara admitted, her voice small. "I don't know how to do this. How to choose someone without crisis forcing my hand. Without survival making the decision for me." She expected frustration. Expected him to push, to demand clarity, to tell her she was being difficult or unfair. every man she'd ever known would have. Instead, Sebastian pulled out the chair beside her and sat, close enough that she could feel his presence but not touching. When he spoke, his voice carried a patience she didn't deserve. "Then we wait until you do. That's not fair to you, Clara." He finally reached for her hand, and she let him take it. "I waited 6 months in exile knowing the king might destroy us both. I can wait however long you need to figure out what you want from a life that's finally, truly yours." She looked down at their joined hands, his larger, scarred from riding and estate work, hers smaller, but no longer trembling. Not possession, not claiming, just connection. On her terms. What if I never figure it out? The fear slipped out before she could stop it. Sebastian's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "Then we'll figure it out together. But Clara? There's no deadline. No expectation. No obligation. You're not a prize I won. You're a woman I'm hoping chooses me back. And that's worth waiting for." 3 days later, they stood in Clara's dressing room surrounded by gowns that Sebastian's sister had left behind months ago, relics from a life before scandal, before exile, before everything changed. "The emerald," Mrs. Ashford suggested, holding up the dress Clara had worn to the Ashworth ball. "You look like a duchess in it." Clara touched the silk, remembering that night. The moment Sebastian had claimed her publicly. The gasps. The shock. Blackwood's rage. No, not that one. She chose instead a gown of deep sapphire, elegant but understated, powerful without being defiant. The color of certainty rather than challenge. Sebastian found her in the entrance hall as the carriage was being prepared, her traveling case already loaded. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the question in his eyes before he asked it. "Are you certain? We can refuse. Send word that you're unwell, that the journey is too much. We can stay here. Stay safe. I'm tired of hiding." Clara pulled on her gloves with deliberate precision. "If we're going to have a life together, whatever that means, I need to face this. Face him. The king doesn't get to summon us like we're pieces on a board anymore. He's still the king, Clara. He still has power over you, perhaps. But I'm not a duke with a political future to protect. I'm just a woman who survived a scandal." She met his eyes. "And I'm tired of letting powerful men decide where I'm allowed to exist." Something like pride flickered across Sebastian's face. "Then let's show His Majesty exactly who Clara Ravenscroft has become." The journey to Windsor took most of the day. They sat across from each other in the carriage, the landscape rolling past in shades of spring green. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with anticipation. Clara studied Sebastian in the changing light. She'd seen him exhausted, furious, calculating, vulnerable. But she realized with sudden clarity how little she actually knew about who he was when he wasn't fighting for her life. "Tell me about your childhood," she said, breaking the quiet. Sebastian looked surprised. "My childhood. You know everything about my worst moments. The abuse, the flight, the scandal. But I know almost nothing about you before I became your crisis to manage." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might deflect. Then he leaned back, his expression softening into something that looked like memory. "I was a serious child. Too serious, my mother used to say. I had 2 older brothers who died before I was 10, scarlet fever. So I inherited a title I was never meant to have, and from that moment on, everything was about duty. Preparation. Living up to the Ravenscroft name. That sounds lonely." It was. He looked out the window. "My father was cold. Practical. He taught me that dukes don't have the luxury of feelings, only responsibilities. That personal happiness was secondary to family legacy and political position." Clara thought about the man who'd sacrificed his entire political future for her. "You're nothing like him." "I tried to be. For years, I convinced myself that power and influence were what mattered. That playing the game correctly was the only thing that defined success." He looked back at her. "Then I found you in the snow, and every rule I'd lived by became negotiable. Do you regret that?" "Which part? Defying the Lord Chancellor? Facing down the king? Losing my seat in Parliament?" "All of it." Sebastian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "I regret that you had to suffer to get here. I regret that saving you meant exposing you. But becoming someone who would choose a person over power? No, I don't regret that at all." Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not gratitude, not obligation, but something closer to understanding. They'd both been shaped by crisis, yes. But underneath the survival, there was a man who'd been waiting his entire life for permission to care about something more than duty. Your mother, Clara said softly. Is she still? She died when I was 12. But she would have liked you. She believed happiness mattered more than reputation. My father never forgave her for that. They talked the rest of the journey, about siblings and childhood fears, and the small moments that shape people before tragedy finds them. Clara learned about Sebastian's love of architecture, his terrible singing voice, the dog he'd had as a boy. Sebastian learned about her mother's garden, her talent for drawing, the way she used to hide in the library to escape her father's business meetings. By the time Windsor Castle came into view, all imposing stone and royal banners snapping in the wind, Clara felt like she knew him. Not the Duke who'd saved her. Just Sebastian, the man who'd grown up lonely and learned to care anyway. The carriage slowed as they approached the gates. Both of them felt it, the weight of what was coming, the awareness that whatever the king wanted, it wouldn't be simple. Guards in royal livery stepped forward as they stopped. One opened the carriage door, his face professionally neutral. Your Graces, His Majesty is expecting you. A pause, and his eyes flicked to Clara with something that might have been surprise. Both of you. Sebastian descended first, then turned to help Clara down. Their hands clasped, and she felt him squeeze once. Reassurance or solidarity, she wasn't sure which. Together, they walked through the gates of Windsor Castle to face whatever test the king had prepared. The king's private audience chamber was different this time. Brighter, more formal, with afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked Windsor's manicured gardens. And this time, Clara wasn't waiting in a corridor or hiding behind a veil. She stood beside Sebastian as they were announced, her hand resting lightly on his arm, present and accounted for. King George IV sat in the same chair that wasn't quite a throne, but his posture was less casual than Sebastian had described from their previous meeting. He studied them both with the calculating attention of a man examining a particularly interesting puzzle he was determined to solve. So, the king's voice carried amusement and something sharper. The Duke and his controversial bride. Together at last, and in my presence no less. Clara felt Sebastian's arm tense beneath her hand, but she kept her own expression carefully neutral. She'd faced Blackwood's cruelty and a courtroom's judgment. She could face a king's scrutiny. Your Majesty. Sebastian bowed with precise formality. Clara curtsied, years of training taking over even as her heart raced. Please sit. The king gestured to two chairs arranged before him, an intimacy that felt more like interrogation than hospitality. I trust your journey was pleasant. It was, Your Majesty, Clara said, finding her voice. If she was going to be examined, she wouldn't be silent through it. The king's eyebrows rose slightly, surprised, perhaps, that she'd spoken first. Good. I'm glad. I imagine you've both been wondering why I summoned you after these months of, shall we call it exile? The thought had occurred to us, Sebastian said carefully. I'll be direct then. I don't apologize for the position I put you in, Ravenscroft. The poison, the pressure, the public inquiry, all of it was necessary. You defied legal authority, made yourself a folk hero, and created a precedent I couldn't allow to stand unchallenged. Clara felt anger flash hot in her chest, but Sebastian's hand found hers, squeezed once. Wait. However, the king continued, leaning back in his chair. You also exposed a genuine monster. Blackwood's crimes were extensive, worse than even I had suspected. Your testimony, Lady Ravenscroft's courage in surviving it, the evidence you compiled, all of that served the crown's interests, even if that wasn't your intention. We're gratified His Majesty found some value in our suffering, Clara said, her voice honeyed with barely concealed steel. The king's lips twitched, amusement or annoyance, impossible to tell. You've grown bold, Lady Ravenscroft. I remember when you were too terrified to speak above a whisper. I'm not that woman anymore, Your Majesty. No, you're not. The king's gaze shifted between them, assessing. Which brings me to my purpose. I'm offering you a return, Ravenscroft. Full restoration. Your seat in Parliament. Consideration for crown appointments. Access to court functions. Everything you lost when you chose defiance over duty. The words hung in the air like a gift that felt too heavy to accept. Clara felt Sebastian go very still beside her. That's generous, Your Majesty, Sebastian said slowly. What's the condition? perceptive as always. The king stood, walked to the window, his back to them. I need a diplomatic envoy to France. Delicate negotiations regarding trade agreements and colonial boundaries. It requires someone with intelligence, political acumen, and the ability to navigate complex social situations without creating international incidents. I'm honored by your Majesty's confidence. The mission will take 6 months, possibly a year, depending on how negotiations progress. The king turned back, and his expression was calculating. You would go alone. No wife. No family. Just you and the weight of crown responsibility. Clara understood immediately. This wasn't an offer. It was a test. Your Majesty, she said carefully, you're asking my husband to choose between his restored career and his marriage. I'm asking nothing of the sort, Lady Ravenscroft. I'm offering your husband an opportunity to serve his country and reclaim his position. Whether that's compatible with your marriage is something only you two can determine. If our marriage is genuine, Sebastian said, his voice hard, it will survive separation. If it's not, better we discover that now. The king smiled. Precisely. You see, I've spent considerable time wondering whether what you two have is love or simply shared trauma. Whether you're truly devoted to each other, or whether you've simply confused survival for affection. He returned to his chair, settled into it with casual authority. 6 months apart will answer that question definitively. Clara felt the trap close around them with elegant precision. Accept, and they'd be separated for half a year or more, forced to prove their bond was real while living completely separate lives. Refuse, and Sebastian would never escape his exile, never reclaim the future he'd sacrificed. The king was betting they'd break apart, betting that without crisis to bind them, they'd discover they had nothing real between them. She looked at Sebastian and saw him already looking at her, not at the king, not calculating political angles or weighing consequences. Just looking at her with a question in his eyes. What do you want? For the first time since she'd met him, Sebastian Ravenscroft was putting a decision entirely in her hands. Not protecting her from it. Not making the choice for her sake. Just waiting. Clara felt the weight of it. The power of choosing not just for herself, but for both of them. The king wanted to know if their marriage was real. But the real question was whether she trusted it enough to survive distance. She thought about the carriage ride. About learning who Sebastian was beneath the crisis. About the way he'd waited for her permission at breakfast, giving her space to define what they were. About the man who'd chosen her over power once, and was now asking if she'd choose him over fear. Clara turned to the king, her voice steady. When does he leave? Sebastian's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but she felt it. Felt his surprise that she'd answered before he could refuse, before he could sacrifice the opportunity for her sake. The king's smile widened, satisfied, like a chess player whose gambit had been accepted. 3 weeks. Time enough to prepare and say your farewells. He stood, signaling the audience was ending. I'll have the foreign secretary send over the details. Welcome back to the game, Ravenscroft. Let's see if you still know how to play it. They were dismissed with formal courtesy, ushered out by guards who appeared the moment the king gestured. Clara kept her composure until they reached the corridor, until the door closed behind them, and they were alone in the gilded hallway. Then Sebastian turned to her, his expression unreadable. You said yes. I said, when does he leave? That's not the same as yes. Clara, we need to talk. But not here. She looked around at the palace walls that undoubtedly had ears. Somewhere private. They found a small garden courtyard, empty in the late afternoon. The moment they were alone, Sebastian's careful composure cracked. You can't seriously want me to accept this. Clara met his eyes. Don't you? They walked Windsor's gardens in silence, following gravel paths that wound through meticulously maintained hedges and flower beds just beginning to bloom. Other courtiers gave them wide berth. Whether out of respect or scandal, Clara couldn't tell and didn't care. You should go, she said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched since they'd left the courtyard. Sebastian stopped walking. What? To France. You should accept the king's offer. Go. I'm not leaving you for 6 months after everything we've. He caught himself, jaw tightening with frustration. Clara, this is obviously another one of his games. He's testing us. Trying to prove we're not real. Maybe we need to prove it. She turned to face him fully. This is your chance to get your life back. Your real life. Not exile. Not political death. Not sitting in Raven's Hollow managing an estate while your peers make decisions that shape the country. Everything you sacrificed for me, he's offering it back. At the cost of leaving you for half a year or more. Is that really such a terrible cost? The question came out sharper than she intended. You've spent 10 months fighting for me, protecting me, sacrificing for me. Maybe you need 6 months to remember who you are when I'm not your crisis to solve. Sebastian's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like hurt. You think that's all you are to me? A crisis? I don't know. The admission burst from her with more force than she'd meant. That's the problem, Sebastian. We went from you finding me dying in the snow to public engagement to crown inquiries to exile, all in less than a year. We've never had time to just be. Without threats. Without survival. Without crisis forcing every decision. She started walking again, needing movement to contain the emotions threatening to overflow. Sebastian followed, his long strides easily keeping pace. You've never had time to choose me, Clara continued, her voice quieter now. You only had time to save me. And I need to know, we both need to know, if what we have exists without the emergency. So your solution is to spend 6 months apart? My solution is to let you have your life back and see if you still want me in it when you remember what that life felt like. She stopped by a fountain, watched water cascade over marble without really seeing it. You gave up parliament, crown appointments, political influence, everything that defined you before I stumbled into your world covered in blood and desperation. I know what I gave up. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you've never had time to actually feel the loss. You went from sacrifice to exile to building a new life with me, all without pausing to consider whether the trade was worth it. Sebastian moved in front of her, forcing her to look at him. Are you seriously suggesting I don't know my own mind? I'm suggesting that trauma makes everything feel more intense than it is. That shared survival creates bonds that feel like love but might just be dependency, gratitude, habit. Her voice cracked. I'm terrified, Sebastian. Terrified that once you're back in London, surrounded by the life you used to have, you'll realize I was never worth the cost. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Sebastian's expression softened, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. Is that what you really think? That I'll leave and suddenly realize I made a mistake? Wouldn't you? If you were logical about it? You're a duke who gave up his entire political future for a woman you barely knew, whose presence in your life has brought nothing but scandal and complication. And love, Sebastian said quietly. You're forgetting love. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. How do you know it's love and not just residual adrenaline? We've been in survival mode since the moment we met. Maybe what feels like love is just our bodies confusing relief with affection. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, and she watched emotions play across his face. Frustration, understanding, fear, and something that looked like determination. You want to know what I'm afraid of? He asked finally. I'm afraid that 6 months apart will give you time to realize you only stayed out of gratitude. That without me there, you'll discover you're perfectly fine on your own. Better, even, and when I come back, you'll have moved on. The admission surprised her. She'd been so focused on her own fears that she hadn't considered he might be carrying the same doubts in reverse. I'm afraid, Sebastian continued, that I'll return to find you've built a life that doesn't need me in it. That you'll have realized the only reason you chose me was because I was there. Because I was safe. Because after Blackwood, any man who didn't hurt you felt like love. Clara reached for his hand, held it between both of hers. So we're both terrified this isn't real. It appears so. Then maybe that's exactly why you need to go. She squeezed his hand, drew strength from the connection even as she prepared to let go. If we're real, if this is real, it will survive 6 months. It will survive distance and time and you remembering what your old life felt like. And if it doesn't, then we were fooling ourselves from the beginning. Sebastian finished, his voice hollow. Yes. Clara looked up at him, memorizing his face in the late afternoon light. I'd rather know now than discover it 5 years from now when we're too entangled to walk away cleanly. Sebastian pulled his hand free, and for a moment she thought he'd argue, refuse, make the decision for both of them the way he always had. But instead, he cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. You're asking me to choose between you and my life's work. No. Clara covered his hand with hers. I'm asking you to choose both and see if they're compatible. I'm asking you to prove the king wrong. To prove we're not just trauma and survival dressed up as devotion. She stepped back, breaking the contact, steeling herself for what came next. Accept the king's offer. Go to France. Do the work you were meant to do. And if in 6 months you come back and still want this, still want me, want us, want the complicated, messy life we've built, then I'll know it's real. We'll both know. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him warring with himself, the instinct to protect her clashing with the respect to honor her choice. Finally, he nodded slowly. And what will you do? While I'm gone. Clara thought about Raven's Hollow, about her foundation, about the life she'd started building that was hers alone. I'll figure out who Clara Ravenscroft is when she's not running or recovering or being saved. Maybe that's what we both need. Time to be ourselves separately before we can really be together. 6 months, Sebastian said, and it sounded like both a promise and a question. 6 months. If we're real, we'll survive the distance. He reached for her one more time, pulled her close, and kissed her with a desperation that felt like goodbye and promise tangled together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. I'll come back for you. Then I'll be here waiting. And we'll know. 2 weeks. 14 days of painful proximity, of knowing every breakfast might be their last together for half a year, of trying to memorize the small details, the way Sebastian frowned at correspondence, the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the particular quality of silence when they sat reading in the library together. They went through the motions of daily life at Raven's Hollow, but everything felt heightened, fragile, temporary. Clara found herself cataloging moments. The way morning light caught in Sebastian's dark hair, the rare times he laughed at something Mrs. Ashford said, the calluses on his hands from estate work that had nothing to do with politics. You need to understand the accounts, Sebastian said on the 5th day, spreading ledgers across his desk. The estate finances, the tenant agreements, the investments. Clara sat beside him, closer than strictly necessary, breathing in the scent of paper and ink and him. You have Aldrich for this. Aldrich is excellent. But if something happens to me, I need you to understand everything. To not be dependent on anyone's interpretation or goodwill. He showed her columns of numbers, explaining revenue streams and expenditures with patient detail. She tried to focus, tried to absorb the information, but found herself distracted by the nearness of him, by the knowledge that soon this chair would be empty and she'd be managing these accounts alone. Your turn, Clara said the next day, leading him through the operations of her foundation. They visited safe houses she'd established, met women who'd fled situations like hers. Sebastian listened as Clara explained the legal assistance, the medical care, the process of helping women disappear when necessary. You've built something remarkable, he said as they rode back to Raven's Hollow. Something that will outlast both of us. It's what I wish had existed for me. Clara looked out at the countryside passing by. When I ran from Blackwood, I had nowhere to go but blind hope and snow. No one should have to make that choice. They were learning to be partners, she realized. Not survivor and protector, not scandal and consequence, but two people building something together. It made leaving both harder and more necessary. They needed to know if what they were building could survive interruption. The night before departure, Sebastian found her in the library where this had all begun, where he'd told her months ago that she was under his protection. There's something I need to do. He sat beside her, produced a stack of legal documents from his portfolio. These give you complete access to everything. The estate accounts, the London properties, my investments, legal authority to act on my behalf in all matters. Clara scanned the papers, her heart clenching. Sebastian, if something happens to me in France, an accident, an illness, political complications, you're not dependent on anyone. Not my family. Not the crown. Not some distant male relative who'd inherit the estate. Everything I have becomes yours, completely and irrevocably. She looked up from the documents, saw the intensity in his eyes. You're still protecting me. Even in leaving. Always. No apology in his voice. That doesn't stop just because we're testing whether this is real. You have your own money from the trust one established before, but this is different. This is full autonomy. Full control. Clara felt something break open in her chest. Not quite tears, but close. I don't want your money, Sebastian. I want What do you want? He asked it gently, the question he'd been asking her since the morning after their first kiss. I don't know. The words came out strangled, frustration and fear tangled together. I don't know how to be without you anymore. And I hate that. I hate that I need you. I spent my whole life having men control me through dependency, my father through money, Blackwood through marriage. And now you've made yourself necessary to my happiness, and that terrifies me. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then he took her hands, held them firmly between his. Needing someone isn't weakness, Clara. It's trust. And trust is a choice. It doesn't feel like a choice when losing you would destroy me. Love never feels like a choice. It feels like inevitability. Like breathing. He squeezed her hands. But choosing to stay, choosing to wait, choosing to believe we'll survive this, those are choices. And you're making them. That's the difference between dependency and devotion. Clara leaned forward, pressed her forehead against his shoulder, felt his arms come around her. I'm supposed to be proving I can be independent. That I'm not just clinging to you out of trauma. You are independent. You run an entire foundation. You manage complex estate business. You challenge kings without flinching. The fact that you also love me doesn't diminish any of that. How are you so certain? She pulled back to look at him. How do you know this is real and not just? Because I've been without you before. I had 30 years of life without you in it. It was fine. Successful. Empty. His thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. And then I spent 10 months with you, and fine stopped being enough. So I know the difference. 6 months apart won't make me forget it. Clara wanted to believe him. Wanted to trust that the bond between them was strong enough to survive distance and doubt and the king's calculated test. But fear still coiled tight in her stomach. They didn't sleep that night. Stayed in the library talking about everything and nothing. Childhood memories, fears for the future, small observations about life they'd never had time to share. As dawn approached, they moved to the window that overlooked the moors, watched the sky lighten from black to gray to gold. The same window where Clara had once stood watching snow fall while planning her escape from a house that felt like a cage. Now she stood in front of it preparing to let Sebastian leave, and this house felt like home. Morning came too quickly. Sebastian's horse was prepared, his traveling case loaded. The household staff gathered in the entrance hall, Mrs. Ashford crying into her apron, Captain Lockhart standing at attention, Aldridge maintaining dignity while his eyes shone suspiciously bright. Sebastian held Clara one last time in the doorway, and she memorized the feeling, his arms around her, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, the scent of him that meant safety and challenge and home. 6 months, he murmured against her hair. 6 months, she repeated, forcing herself to step back, to let go. She watched from the library window as Sebastian mounted his horse. He looked back once, found her silhouette in the glass, raised his hand in farewell. Then he rode through Ravenshallow's gates and disappeared down the road toward London, toward France, toward a life that didn't include her. Clara pressed her palm against the cold window glass, the same window where this had all begun. But this time she wasn't running. This time she was choosing to stay, choosing to wait, choosing to trust that what they'd built was strong enough to survive the testing. The moors stretched empty and beautiful before her. No snow, no blood, no desperation. Just choice. Just trust. Just the terrifying, liberating act of letting someone go and believing they'd come back. The first letter arrived 4 days after Sebastian left, carried by royal courier and sealed with wax that bore the Ravenscroft crest. Clara opened it in the library, her hands steadier than she'd expected. Dearest Clara, Paris is exactly as I remember. Beautiful, complicated, and exhausting. The French diplomats are masters of saying everything while revealing nothing. I suspect the next 6 months will age me considerably. The lodgings the crown secured are adequate but empty. I find myself looking for you in doorways, listening for your footsteps in corridors where you've never walked. It's ridiculous, but there it is. How are things at Ravenshollow? Has Aldridge driven you to distraction with his insistence on proper accounting procedures? Tell me everything. Yours S. Clara wrote back that evening, her own letter careful and measured. Dear Sebastian, Ravenshollow as well. The spring planting is proceeding on schedule, and I've approved repairs to the tenant cottages on the eastern border. Aldridge has indeed driven me nearly mad with his accounting procedures, but I suspect he's testing whether I'm truly capable of managing in your absence. Your foundation continues to expand. We've established a fourth safe house in Yorkshire. 3 women arrived this week, and seeing them find safety makes your sacrifice feel less heavy. I think of you often. I hope Paris treats you kindly. Clara. 3 months passed in an exchange of careful correspondence. Sebastian's letters described diplomatic dinners, negotiations over tariffs, the delicate dance of international politics. But between the lines, Clara read his loneliness. I dined with the ambassador tonight. He asked about you. Everyone asks about you, actually. The scandal has made you rather famous even here. I realized as I was answering his questions that I could talk about nothing else. You should have seen his face when I spent 20 minutes describing your foundation instead of discussing trade policy. Clara found herself reading that line over and over, something warm blooming in her chest. Her own letters grew longer, more detailed. She wrote about the estate, yes, but also about smaller moments. Mrs. Ashford's gossip, Captain Lockhart teaching her to shoot, the way spring was transforming the moors into something beautiful. Mrs. Phillip's daughter, do you remember her? The one whose son we gave work in the stables, came to see me yesterday. She asked if love was worth the pain. I didn't know how to answer. I still don't. But I think perhaps the question itself is wrong. Love isn't something we weigh against pain. It simply is, and we survive it, or we don't. At Ravenshollow, Clara discovered she was more capable than she believed. She mediated disputes between tenants, made decisions about estate investments, expanded her foundation with ruthless efficiency. Aldrich stopped testing her and started genuinely consulting her. Captain Lockhart reported to her with the same respect he'd shown Sebastian. She was building a life that was hers, and it felt both liberating and terrifying. In Paris, Sebastian navigated diplomatic complexities with the skill that had once made him indispensable to the crown. He negotiated trade agreements, smoothed over cultural misunderstandings, represented British interests with efficiency. But at night, alone in lodgings that felt temporary and cold, he wrote letters that revealed the cost. Around month 4, something shifted. Their letters became rawer, more vulnerable, as if the distance had stripped away pretense. Clara, I attended a ball at Versailles tonight. It was magnificent. Chandeliers, music, hundreds of Europe's most influential families. And all I could think was how much I wanted to leave. How much I wanted to be in a quiet library at Ravenshollow reading across from you. I'm afraid. There, I've said it. I'm afraid of coming back and finding you've realized you're better off without the complications I bring. That you've built this beautiful, functional life, and I'll only disrupt it. That you've been happy without me, and my return will feel like an intrusion rather than a homecoming. Do you ever regret asking me to go? S. Clara held that letter for 2 days before she could bring herself to respond. Sebastian, I regret it every single day, and I'd make the same choice again, and that's what terrifies me. I'm afraid too. Afraid of you coming back and realizing I'm not the woman you imagined when you were away. That in your memory, I've become more than I actually am, braver, stronger, better. Afraid that the real me, the one who still has nightmares and doubts and moments of weakness, will disappoint you. But more than anything, I'm afraid that we're both spending these months terrified of the same thing, that this won't survive normalcy, that we only worked in crisis. Come home soon. I miss you more than I know how to say. Clara. Then, in week 15, Sebastian's letters stopped. Clara told herself it was the postal service, international delays, 1,000 reasonable explanations. But after 1 week became 2, and 2 became 3, the reasonable explanations began to feel like desperate hope. She wrote anyway, sending letters into silence. Sebastian, I haven't heard from you in 2 weeks. I'm trying not to worry, but I'm failing spectacularly. Please write. Even just a line to tell me you're well. Nothing. 3 weeks now. Aldrich suggests the diplomatic pouches may be delayed. Captain Lockhart says I'm worrying unnecessarily. But something feels wrong. I know it sounds absurd, but I feel it. Still nothing. On the 23rd day, without word, a messenger arrived bearing the seal of the British Embassy in Paris. Clara's hands shook as she broke the wax. Her heart already knowing before her mind did that whatever news this brought, it was bad. The message was brief, formal, devastating. Lady Ravenscroft, we regret to inform you that His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft, was injured 3 weeks ago in an incident near the French border. His condition is stable but serious. He has been asking for you. Further details will follow. We recommend you make arrangements to travel to Paris with all possible speed. Your obedient servant, Sir Richard Whitmore, British Ambassador to France." The letter slipped from Clara's fingers, fluttering to the library floor. Injured. 3 weeks ago. The same time as letters had stopped. She stood frozen for a moment, mind racing through possibilities. Accident, illness, attack. Then training took over. The same survival instinct that had carried her through snow and scandal and courtrooms. Clara turned to Mrs. Ashford, who'd appeared in the doorway drawn by the commotion. "Pack my things. Everything I need for extended travel. And send for Captain Lockhart. We leave for Paris in an hour. Your Grace, surely you should wait for more information. He's asking for me." Clara's voice was steel-wrapped in fear. "I'm not waiting." Clara stood in Ravenshallow's entrance hall holding the message from the British Embassy, the words blurring as she read them for the third time. "The Duke has been injured. Details to follow." Injured. Not dead, but injured. Which could mean anything from a broken bone to death's door. "Prepare the carriage," she told Captain Lockhart, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I'm going to France. Your Grace." Lockhart stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "We don't know the situation. It could be dangerous. Perhaps it's better to wait for more information before." "I've waited long enough." Clara moved past him toward the stairs, already calculating what she'd need. "I've waited 4 months for letters. Waited 3 weeks for news after the silence. I'm done waiting. Your Grace, with respect, traveling to France alone as a woman. I'm not just a woman, Captain. I'm a Duchess. And my husband needs me." She paused on the landing, looked back at Lockhart. "You can come with me or stay here. But I'm leaving within the hour." Mrs. Ashford appeared with traveling clothes already prepared, as if she'd known the moment Clara received the message what would happen. "I've packed what you'll need, Your Grace." "Captain Lockhart, stop arguing and ready the escort." Her Grace has made her decision. Clara felt something click into place as she dressed. A clarity she'd been missing for months. This wasn't obligation driving her. Not gratitude for everything Sebastian had done. Not dependency or trauma or fear of being alone. This was choice. Pure, clear, terrifying choice. She was choosing him. Choosing to go to him. Choosing to face whatever danger or complication awaited because the alternative, staying safe at Ravenshollow while he might be dying in a foreign country, was unthinkable. The journey to France was a lesson in wielding power she'd never fully understood she possessed. At Dover, the crossing was delayed due to weather. Clara presented Sebastian's diplomatic credentials, which gave her access to priority passage, and was aboard a ship within hours. At Calais, French officials questioned why an English duchess was traveling without her husband. Clara explained in careful French that her husband was injured in Paris and she was joining him. When they hesitated, she dropped names: the British ambassador, the foreign secretary, Sebastian's diplomatic mission. Doors opened. She wasn't the woman who'd fled through the snow anymore, helpless and desperate. She was Clara Ravenscroft, Duchess, wielding her husband's name and connections like weapons, using everything he'd given her access to. And it worked. The roads to Paris were difficult, muddy from spring rains, crowded with travelers. Clara pushed forward anyway, stopping only when the horses needed rest, sleeping in carriages when they couldn't reach an inn. Captain Lockhart and 2 guards accompanied her, but she barely noticed them. All her focus was forward, toward Paris, toward Sebastian. 3 days of travel that should have taken 5. When they finally reached the city, Clara went directly to the British Embassy, presented herself to a startled clerk. "I'm the Duchess of Ravenscroft. My husband is serving on a diplomatic mission. I received word he was injured. Take me to him. Now." The clerk stammered something about protocol, about waiting for the ambassador, but Clara had learned in the past 4 months that she could be just as immovable as Sebastian when necessary. "Now," she repeated, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down a king. They took her to a private residence in the Marais, an elegant townhouse that served as additional diplomatic housing. A physician was leaving as she arrived, his expression grim. "The Duke is stable," he told her in accented English. But he was fortunate. 6 inches to the left, and the blade would have found his heart. Blade. Not an accident, then. An attack. Clara pushed past the physician, took the stairs 2 at a time, followed the sound of voices to a bedroom where Sebastian lay propped against pillows, his chest bandaged, his face pale but alive. gloriously, miraculously alive. He looked up when she entered, and shock replaced the exhaustion in his expression. Clara, don't. She crossed to his bedside, anger and relief warring in her chest. Don't you dare ask what I'm doing here. Clara, you shouldn't have. Shouldn't have what? She sat on the edge of his bed, careful not to jostle his injury. Come for you the way you came for me. Traveled across a country to make sure you were alive. Used every connection and resource you gave me to get here. Sebastian's hand found hers, gripped with surprising strength for a man who'd been stabbed. It's dangerous. There was an attack. I know there was an attack. That's why I'm here. She studied his face, saw the bandages beneath his nightshirt, the evidence of how close she'd come to losing him. Tell me what happened. Mr. Graves emerged from a corner of the room where Clara hadn't noticed him. Your Grace, perhaps this should wait until. Tell me. Now. Sebastian exchanged a glance with his solicitor, then sighed. The attack wasn't random. It was orchestrated by allies of Blackwood's family. Revenge for his exile and disgrace. They hired an assassin to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Blackwood. Clara's voice went flat. Even in exile, he's still trying to destroy you. Not me, Sebastian said quietly. Us. The assassin was meant to kill me and then deliver a message to you. They wanted you to know it was their doing. Wanted you to live with the knowledge that loving me got me killed. The cruelty of it hit Clara like a physical blow. Blackwood couldn't touch her directly anymore, so he'd found a way to hurt her through Sebastian, to turn their love into a weapon against them. But I survived, Sebastian continued, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Graves and the guards intervened. The assassin was captured. He confessed everything. Blackwood's remaining allies are being rounded up now. Good. Clara's grip tightened on his hand. Let them rot. Sebastian studied her face, and she saw wonder mixing with the exhaustion. You came. Across a country, through dangerous territory, risking. I came because I choose you. The words came out fierce, certain. Not out of debt. Not out of gratitude or obligation or trauma. I choose you, Sebastian. The way you chose me in the snow. The way you chose me in the ballroom. The way you've chosen me every day since. Clara, I'm not leaving, she said, cutting off whatever argument he was preparing. And before you start about danger or propriety or anything else, this isn't about protection. This is about choice. For months ago, I sent you away to prove we were real. To prove I could be independent. And I was. I am. But independence doesn't mean being alone. It means having the freedom to choose who I want beside me. She leaned closer, careful of his injuries, close enough that he could see the tears she was refusing to let fall. I choose you. Every complicated, frustrating, wonderful part of this. I choose us. So you're going to recover, and we're going to finish this diplomatic mission together, and then we're going home. To Raven's Hollow. To the life we're building. Together. Sebastian's free hand came up to cup her face, and she saw emotions swimming in his dark eyes. Relief and love, and something that looked like gratitude. 6 months, he murmured. We were supposed to have 6 months apart to prove this was real. We had 4. That's close enough. Clara allowed herself to smile, to feel the terror of the last 3 days finally releasing its grip. Besides, I think traveling across France to save your life is a better test than sitting at home writing letters. You didn't save my life. The guards. I saved you from dying alone, Clara corrected. From facing recovery without me. From thinking even for a moment that I might not come. Sebastian pulled her down gently, pressed a kiss to her forehead that felt like a promise. I knew you'd come. Liar. You're surprised I'm here. I'm surprised at how fast you got here. But I knew you'd come. His arms came around her carefully, mindful of his injury. Because somewhere in the last 4 months, I stopped being afraid you'd leave. And you stopped being afraid I wanted to. Clara settled against him, listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong and alive. So what does that mean? It means we're real, Clara. Even the king's test couldn't break us. Even Blackwood's final attempt at revenge couldn't destroy what we've built. He tightened his hold slightly. It means I love you. Not because you needed saving. Not because I needed to prove something. Just because you're you. And that's more than enough. Clara closed her eyes, let the words wash over her. For months of letters and loneliness and doubt, and in the end, it had taken the threat of losing him to make her realize what she'd known all along. She loved him too. Freely. Wholly. By choice. Then I'm staying. she whispered against his chest. Right here. Until you're well enough to travel home. Captain Lockhart will object. Captain Lockhart can guard the door. Clara smiled. I'm not leaving you again, Sebastian. Not for the king. Not for propriety. Not for anything. And this time, he didn't argue. 2 weeks in Paris. Sebastian recovering in the townhouse while Clara refused to leave his side, despite the scandalized looks from the embassy staff and Mr. Graves' gentle suggestions that perhaps she should return to more appropriate lodgings. Appropriate lodgings can go to hell, Clara had informed them. I'm staying. And she did, sleeping in a chair beside his bed those first terrible nights when fever threatened, changing his bandages when the physician wasn't available, reading to him when pain kept him awake, arguing with him when he tried to work too soon. It was a reversal neither of them had expected, Clara protecting Sebastian, caring for him, refusing to let him push himself before he was ready. The woman he'd found dying in the snow now keeping vigil over his recovery with fierce determination. On the 10th day, when Sebastian was finally strong enough to sit up without assistance, they talked. Really talked. Not about politics or foundations or the practicalities of their life, but about the 4 months apart, about the fears they'd carried, about what they'd learned in the separation. I was terrified the Crown's invitation was a trap, Clara admitted, sitting on the edge of his bed in the afternoon light. I was right to be afraid, but I was wrong about why. Sebastian reached for her hand. What do you mean? It wasn't a trap for you. It was a test for me. She looked down at their joined hands. To see if I'd choose you when it wasn't about survival. When there was no crisis forcing my hand. When I had every reason to stay safe at Raven's Hollow and let you handle your life separately. And you did choose me. His voice carried wonder. You crossed the country to get here. Because somewhere in those 4 months, I stopped being afraid. Clara met his eyes. Afraid that I only loved you because you saved me. Afraid that what we had was just trauma dressed up as devotion. The silence from your letters was terrifying, but it also clarified everything. I didn't want news that you were safe. I wanted you. All of you. The complicated, stubborn, brilliant parts that have nothing to do with rescue or protection. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Every day in France, I waited for your letter telling me you'd moved on, that you'd found a life without crisis and realized you were better off without me in it. I would have understood, Clara. Would have let you go. I know. She squeezed his hand. That's what made me certain. You didn't demand I wait. Didn't guilt me or claim ownership. You just gave me space to choose. And I chose you. Even when I was silent. When you didn't know if I was alive or dead. Especially then. Clara's voice grew fierce. Because the thought of a world without you in it. Not because I needed you to survive, but because I wanted you to exist. That was unbearable. I don't want a life without crisis if it means a life without you. I just needed to know it was my choice. Sebastian pulled her closer, careful of his healing wound. It's always been your choice, Clara. From the moment I made that announcement at the Ashworth ball. I claimed you publicly, yes, but I've been waiting for you to claim me back ever since. Clara felt something release in her chest, the last thread of doubt, the final question about whether this was real. She closed the distance between them, her hands framing his face, her forehead resting against his. What are you allowed to take from me, Sebastian? The question from the library, from months ago, returned with new meaning. His hands came up to cover hers, his dark eyes searching her face. Nothing, unless you give it freely. Then I'm giving you everything. The words came out steady, certain, true. My trust, my future, my heart, all of it, freely. Not because I owe you, not because I'm afraid, because I want to, because choosing you feels like choosing myself. Sebastian's breath caught, and she saw emotions swimming in his eyes, relief and joy and love all tangled together. Then I surrender, Clara whispered. To you, to this, to us. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like their desperate first kiss or the goodbye kiss before he left for France. This was certain, chosen, real, a promise made freely by two people who'd earned the right to make it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. We should probably tell the king his test is over. Clara laughed, the sound bright and free. Let him figure it out himself. I'm done performing for the crown. What about performing for me? That depends. She traced his jaw with gentle fingers. What did you have in mind? Sebastian smiled. That genuine smile she'd worked so hard to earn. Just this. Every day? For the rest of our lives. Then I surrender, Clara said again, sealing the promise with another kiss. Completely. By choice. And in the Paris townhouse, surrounded by political intrigue and recovery and the messy reality of building a life together, two people who'd survived everything finally stopped surviving and started living. Together. By choice. Freely. 6 months later, spring returned to Raven's Hollow with a gentleness that felt like benediction. Clara woke to morning light filtering through curtains and the warmth of Sebastian beside her. No longer a surprise. No longer weighted with uncertainty. Just the comfortable reality of a life they'd chosen together. She watched him sleep for a moment, marveling at how ordinary this had become. How precious ordinary could be. His diplomatic mission to France had been successful. More than successful. His negotiations had secured trade agreements that benefited both countries, and he'd navigated the complex politics with the skill that had once made him invaluable to the crown. King George had restored his position fully, invited him back to Parliament, offered crown appointments. But Sebastian had negotiated his own terms this time. He'd return to London for critical votes, serve on select committees, advise when asked. But he wouldn't be owned. Wouldn't sacrifice his life at Raven's Hollow or his work with Clara's foundation for political games. He had influence now, but on his terms. And the king, surprisingly, had accepted. Perhaps because Sebastian had proven himself irreplaceable. Or perhaps because even kings recognized that some things mattered more than power. Clara's foundation had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. What had started as a few safe houses had expanded across 3 counties: legal assistance, medical care, employment placement, education programs. She'd become a quiet force, working with women's reformers, challenging laws that treated wives as property, creating networks that helped women escape and rebuild. They'd built something together that was theirs, not defined by crisis or survival or other people's expectations. Just theirs. "You're thinking too loudly," Sebastian murmured without opening his eyes. "I can hear your brain working from here." Clara smiled, traced a finger along his jaw. "Just thinking about how ordinary this is, and how grateful I am for ordinary." He opened his eyes, pulled her closer. Ordinary is vastly underrated. They went through their morning routine, breakfast together in the sunny breakfast room, reviewing correspondence, discussing estate business and foundation matters. Clara challenged his position on a parliamentary vote regarding women's property rights. Sebastian countered with political realities. They debated over toast and tea, each respecting the other's expertise, neither backing down. This was their love language now. Challenging each other, learning from each other, building something bigger than either of them alone could create. "You're going to lose that vote if you don't bring the moderates along first," Clara said, refilling his tea. "And you're going to lose funding for your eastern expansion if you don't frame it as economic benefit rather than moral imperative. I can do both. Then I can bring the moderates along." Sebastian smiled. "See? We're both impossibly stubborn. It's why this works." A carriage arriving interrupted their debate. Clara looked out the window and felt surprise followed by cautious hope. "It's Margaret." Sebastian's sister hadn't visited since their marriage. Hadn't written except for formal acknowledgments of major events. The breach had been painful, one more cost of their choices, but Clara had understood. Margaret had a family to protect, a social position to maintain. Associating with scandal had consequences. But now Margaret stood in Ravenshallow's entrance hall, older somehow, her expression uncertain as Clara descended the stairs. "Margaret." Clara kept her voice neutral, polite. "Clara." Margaret's hands twisted her gloves. May I speak with you? Both of you?" They settled in the drawing room. Tea served with the formal precision that marked uncomfortable family gatherings. Margaret sat across from them, and Clara saw her struggling to find words. "I was wrong," Margaret said finally. "About both of you. About what matters." Sebastian leaned forward. "Margaret, let me finish. Please." She looked between them, tears shining in her eyes. "I abandoned you when you needed family most. I chose social standing over my brother. I convinced myself it was necessary, that I was protecting my children. But I was really just afraid. Afraid of what supporting you would cost me." "You had legitimate concerns," Clara said quietly. "We understood. No, you were gracious. But understanding doesn't mean I was right." Margaret set down her teacup with trembling hands. I watched you both from a distance these past months. Saw the work you're doing, Sebastian's negotiations in France, Clara's foundation expanding. I read about the king restoring Sebastian's position, but on his terms, not the crown's. And I realized, you didn't just survive the scandal. You built something better than what existed before. She looked at Clara directly. I judged you. Thought you were a complication Sebastian should have avoided. I was wrong. You made him better. Made him choose what actually mattered over what was expected. And that terrified me because it meant examining my own choices. Clara felt Sebastian's hand find hers, squeezed gently. I'm asking, Margaret continued, if there's space for me in this life you've built. If you can forgive my cowardice. I don't expect. Yes, Clara said simply. There's space. There's always been space. We just needed you to choose it. Margaret broke down then, and Clara crossed to her, held Sebastian's sister while she cried. When the tears subsided, they talked, really talked, about family and choices and the cost of living authentically. By the time Margaret left hours later, something had been repaired that Clara hadn't realized was still broken. That evening, Clara and Sebastian walked the moors where this had all begun. No snow this time. Wildflowers bloomed across the hillsides in riots of purple and gold. The same landscape that had nearly killed her now felt like home. Do you ever regret it? Clara asked, pausing where he'd found her that winter night. Everything you gave up. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was serious. Every single day. Clara felt her heart clench, looked at him with hurt starting to bloom, until he continued. I regret that I didn't find you sooner. That you suffered it all with Blackwood. That I couldn't protect you from the Crown inquiry, from having your trauma made public. I regret every moment of pain you endured that I couldn't prevent. He turned to face her fully, cupped her face in his hands. But giving up Parliament for you? Trading power for peace? Choosing this life over that one? No, never. Not for a single moment. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Ask me in 10 years if I was worth it. Sebastian smiled. The genuine smile she'd worked months to earn, that still felt like a gift every time she saw it. I already know the answer, but I'll enjoy proving it to you for the next decade. They stood together on the moors as the sun set, painting everything gold and rose. Two people who'd found each other in crisis and chosen each other in peace. Who'd survived separation and doubt and the final attempts of their enemies to tear them apart. Who'd built something real from the wreckage of scandal. When they returned to Raven's Hollow, a letter waited. Clara tensed instinctively. Letters bearing seals still carried weight, but Sebastian opened it with calm curiosity. It's from Margaret. He scanned the contents, and his smile widened. An invitation to the christening of her newest child. Clara read over his shoulder, saw the words that mattered most. We would be honored if you would serve as godparents. Not just an invitation, a reconciliation, a return to family, to society, but on their terms. As the people they'd become rather than the ones they'd been expected to be. Should we accept? Sebastian asked, though she could see he already knew her answer. Yes, on our terms. Together. He pulled her close, pressed a kiss to her temple. Always together. He defied a lord. Defied the crown. Gave up everything. And she chose him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. They earned their peace. They earned each other. And most importantly, they earned their choice. The next morning, they walked Ravenshallow's grounds together, checking on tenant families, discussing foundation expansion, planning their trip to Margaret's christening. Equal partners in every sense. Building a life defined not by what they'd survived, but by what they'd chosen to create. At one point, Sebastian caught Clara's hand, laced their fingers together. She looked down at their joined hands and smiled. Not possession, not claiming, just belonging, mutual, chosen, and unbreakable. The woman who'd once fled through the snow with nothing but desperation and hope had found something she'd never expected. A home built on choice rather than obligation. A love that had survived every test thrown at it. A partnership that made both of them better than they'd been alone. And the Duke who'd once measured his worth in power and position had learned that some things, love, integrity, chosen devotion, mattered more than all the influence in England. They'd earned this. Every quiet moment. Every ordinary day. Every choice to stay when they could have run, to trust when they could have doubted, to build rather than survive. As they walked back toward Ravenshallow's stone walls, the estate that had become their sanctuary, their hands remained clasped. Not because either of them needed holding up, but because they wanted the connection, chose it, every single day. And that choice, that simple, profound, daily choice, was everything.